Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Banguoja conference. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the first session of this year's conference called Storytelling Techniques, How to Build Suspense in Non-Fictional Narratives. Before I get to introducing today's speaker and guest, my name is Agnė Pakšytė. I will be moderating today's session and a couple of sessions afterwards. But before we start, there are a couple of technical simple things I want to let you know. First of all is that all of the information about the program of this year's Banguoja Audio Festival, about the sessions, the events, the conference sessions, all of it can be found on the website banguoja.lt. That's banguoja.lt. And of course, you can ask questions throughout the entire session. That can be easily done via the Q&A tool on Zoom webinars that you can find in the bottom toolbar. It just says Q&A, and then us, the moderators and administrators of the call, can see your questions. So please let us know whatever is interesting for you to ask and figure out. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce today's guest, Sven Preger. Sven is an award-winning journalist, international story consultant, and systemic coach who specializes in telling complex stories and overall loves a good audio story. Sven Preger was part of the team producing the investigative podcast about Germany's far-wing party AfD called The Hunt, and he has also worked on other incredible projects such as the German serial The Hitchhiker, the podcast Deep Talk for National German Radio, and the narrative science podcast Quark's Stories, where he is the creative director. He is also the author of the textbook Storytelling in Radio and Podcast. So we're very excited to have you, Sven, here today to talk us through some storytelling techniques and building suspense. So I hand over the stage to you.
Thank you so much, and I'm excited as well. Thank you for having me. Hopefully the next 45 to 60 minutes will include some interesting lessons for you. First of all, I'll share my screen and to make it possible for you to have some examples as well. So here we go. So hopefully you see all the screen now. Let me start with this. Storytelling is one of these words which has become, I would say, again into fashion in the last at least decade, when not 15 or 20 years. Not due to the podcast scene, but also because we always call, like when we're on social media, we call it an Instagram story, we call it stories on Twitter, we call it a story on TikTok and wherever. So first of all, perhaps it's important to realize that there are two, I don't know, if you may, two interesting perspectives to this. As a maker, a storytelling audio story, at least, is defined more or less as a scenic narrative. So we can't work without scenes. It's not really a surprise, I guess, but it's important to have it in mind to think about, if we talk about storytelling for audio, that it's something about, we need scenes, we need something to happen. As Ira Glass, probably a lot of you will know, the founder of This American Life always said, This American Lie is always nice, also nice. This American Life, obviously, sorry for I misspoke. So he always says there needs something to happen to get a story. So that's one. And from an audience perspective, I think it's very interesting to think of this as, I really want to know what's going to happen next. That's like the core definition of suspense. I really want to know what happens next, and I really want to know what's going on in the next couple of minutes. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to follow a longer audio story, especially a multi-part serial podcast kind of thing. I'll bring to you 7 storytelling, let's call it secrets for the moment. I hope we'll see together. It's not all about secrets, but probably it's a bit more about how you could do things. And the leading question is how to build suspense in non-fiction narratives, which is not very easily done because especially as journalists or documentary makers or audio experts, is always storytelling a bit difficult, or it can be tempting that we shape the story we want to, because that's the way it becomes a better story. But of course, as journalists or documentary makers, it's all about the truth. So it should be a good representation of truth or reality. Otherwise, it has nothing to do with documentaries or journalism. So we need to keep this in mind when we talk about storytelling and suspense creating and non-fictional narratives. On this screen, you just see a few examples which have become more or less a bit famous. For this session, I try to get English-speaking examples, which will be 6 or 7 examples we will listen to will all be English-speaking, so hopefully that's okay with you. So the other Latif is a Radiolab spin-off. S-Town is a couple of years old. The Missing Crypto Queen is something the BBC did a couple of years back. Agnė just mentioned Die Jagd, which is the German title for The Hunt, the podcast about the right-wing party. We did the Trojan Horse Affair. Very nice, I think, the podcast, which comes from Australia. It's on the left side stuff, The British Stole. The Jungle Prince, some podcasts from Denmark, or the Grenfell Tower Podcast Inquiry is also a BBC Newsy podcast, which also has become fashionable over the last couple of things. Let's start. So before we have a look on storytelling secrets, let's talk about, for a short moment, about storytelling sins. And since we talk about seven sins are always very close to mention. So what are the 7 sins of storytelling you could do as documentary makers, or you could do as journalists? As counterintuitive as this sounds, it's nevertheless true. Too many facts too early mean you kill your own suspense. Of course, facts are like the core facts. There's nothing more important than facts, even in longer documentaries and even in good storytelling. But the moment you tell all the facts at the beginning, it's really hard to swallow. It's really hard to follow. And you have to look which facts do you put first, and are there some facts you could keep a bit longer to reveal over the story to create moments of surprise or to create suspense. So too many facts too early, especially I'm from Germany, as Agnė mentioned. We normally do this in this special explanatory white middle-aged man kind of voice, now explaining how you have to see the world. And obviously this is not the way you would like to tell a good story, because people don't want to listen to this any longer. Another big sin of storytelling is like 2 or more stories. This is completely understandable, because as journalists, if you have worked, let's say, on a longer documentary, or you've worked on a podcast project, or on shorter, if you have worked on news as well, you sometimes have the feeling of, well, I know more than I can put into my program. Especially the shorter it is, the more difficult it is, obviously, to select some facts. And we all have this feeling of, oh, I've done my research and I want to present it, and then I want to put it all into one piece, and that's never going to work. Because this is the way suspense is killed as well. Tell one story and make sure that the main important aspects which belong to a story are in that story, of course, but you never can tell all the things you have done your research on, because that would be too much. So there is a selection process involved, and it also is true for news, but it's also true for storytelling. Boring characters. This sounds perhaps counterintuitive as well, because if we talk about non-fictional narratives or non-fictional storytelling, of course, we cannot draw or invent characters or the way people behave. But as long as you're not dealing with them as characters, as long as you just say, well, look, this is an expert, and the expert gives 2 or 3 statements, this person will be boring, more or less. So make sure people who appear in your work are relatable in ways of characters. It's 3-dimensional people. A scientist is not only a scientist is also a person. We will take a look at an example later in a couple of minutes, when hopefully it will become more clear how to deal with this without losing any seriousness for your product. It's not about being more colorful or being less serious about the things you do, but it's about making it more memorable, so to speak. Another point is structure. We'll talk a bit about structure, because if you have no story flow, if you are not following the expectations people have to your story in a certain way, they won't follow. They need leading questions they're interested in, otherwise they won't follow the program. They need a topic they're interested in, otherwise they will probably switch off, whether it's linear, classical radio, or podcast, doesn't matter at that point. And of course, how do you build a plot? It's not that easy, but we'll take a look at this as well. At the core of the 7 sins, I think you could put it like this: as long as we think in topics and don't think in terms of story, it will always be difficult to create suspense. We will put results first. We will not have that many surprises, which from time to time help to get people a bit more excited about the program they are listening to. It will result in boring tape. You will only get short statements. You have to fiddle into your story, and people are not realized. It's the same thing I just have said about boring characters. And of course, this, how shall I put it, this fight for cliffhangers. Not every single episode of every single podcast needs a bad cliffhanger. So if you have a cliffhanger, like there's an open question at the end of your episode, and you can use this to say, well, look, we'll look at this the next time. That's fine, but don't make it too, let's say, artificial, because people will realize and it will cost you credibility. 6, taking yourself too seriously. I don't know, perhaps that's could be a German problem. I guess we always tend to take ourselves very, very seriously. Like we know what we are talking about, and you have to listen to us. So that's probably more a cultural problem on my side of the table. So taking ourselves too seriously doesn't make a good story, because people don't want to be lectured. They want to listen to a good story. And the last thing, the seventh thing, is not so much about storytelling, but if you look, for example, at the few studies, or it's becoming more studies out there about podcasting and why people listen to this and stuff, it's fair to say that the biggest problem at the moment is that people, at least in podcasts, can't find it because it's so much out there and they don't know how to search for it. The podcast apps are still not that well, so they can't find it. And a lot of people doing podcasts, it doesn't matter whether you do this as an independent podcast producer, if they do this for public radio, private radio, it doesn't matter. We don't think too much about distribution, and without putting it out there saying, well, look, there's something we want you to realize, then people wouldn't find it and wouldn't listen to it. So these are 7 storytelling sins. Now let's do this a bit in a more productive way. What can we do about storytelling? What is there as a secret? Let's start with a question mark or an exclamation mark. Make sure people at first have a question in their head, like what's going on there, or they need a surprise, like, look, I've never thought about it that way. I have 2 examples with me just to make it realize, or to get an idea of what I mean by this. The first example is a Radiolab episode. Radiolab is a scientific narrative podcast from the US, which has been a bit of a role model for us creating Quark Stories, which is a narrative science podcast in Germany. And I've brought you the beginning of a story told by Tracy Hunt and Latif Nasser. It's already 5 years ago, but it's nevertheless a very good example of making a question mark in the first place. And the examples we will listen to, it's always will be 90 seconds, 2 minutes or something, so not too long. But try to listen to it and realize what kind of question mark they try to induce in you as listeners. Here we go.
So we're starting in 1998. We're at the Olympics in Nagano,
in Japan.
And
so we've seen the girl
warming up on the ice. You have this woman, this figure skater, Surya Bonali.
How do you spell Surya?
Surya. She's French, 24 years old. She's black.
Was 5 times European champion, but all sorts of problems, particularly injury problems.
She's got an Achilles tendon that's been stitched together.
Pulled a muscle.
She's on painkillers. And
she competed for France in 1994 and just missed the podium.
She's never medaled at the Olympics before. This is probably her last go in front of the world.
For France, here is Surya Bonali.
And it was during this performance that Surya Bonali did something that had never been done by anyone.
Ever.
And you could either see it as a kind of
middle finger to the establishment, like this huge FU, or
Oh my goodness!
hello.
Just this beautiful moment of self-affirmation.
So you immediately ask yourself probably, what did she do in this figure skating way she was going there in Nagano? And that's exactly what they are doing. Set aside the sound design. Radiolab is always doing this in a very rich sound design. It's very smart pieces. Sometimes it can be a bit of confusing, like who's speaking at the moment, but you could do or tell the same story in a more relaxed kind of way with not that rich sound design. And you would ask yourself the same question, like, what did she do? So try to start with this, I don't know, moment of irritation to really reel people in. And try not to only do it with like intellect and argumentation, like it's a very important topic we're talking about, but also in a kind of, if it's possible, emotional way without overdoing the emotional way. Second example, just to give you another idea, it's also, I think, from Latif Nasser. Yes, it is. It's a Radiolab spin-off, and then we will move away from Radiolab to other productions as well. It's called The Other Latif. Has been a podcast serial in 2020, also taught by Latif Nasser. And here he starts not with a question which is induced in you, but with a moment of surprise. And that's the way he did it.
Wait, you're listening?
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
You're
Listening
to Radio Lab.
Radio Lab.
From
WNYC.
See?
Yep.
There's a website called howmanyofme.com. At the top of the page, it says there are 329,470,115 people in the United States. How many have your name? It's a pretty simple website. It uses census data to see how common your name is. You should do it. It's fun. When I type in my name, first name Latif, Latif, last name Nasser, Nasser, what it says is there are one or fewer people in the United States named Latif Nasser. One or fewer? I'm the one. How could there be fewer? Anyway, being the only Latif Nasser in the United States, that's not a surprise to me. I've never met anyone with my name before. Not in high school, college, grad school, not as a journalist where I meet new people almost every day, not even in my trips abroad to Muslim countries where you'd think it would be a more common name. And to be totally honest, I kind of liked it that way. I was special. I was one of a kind. Until I wasn't.
So same question induced in you, like what? What does he mean by until I wasn't? So there is somebody, and we'll find out there is a detainee in Guantanamo who has the same name, Latif Nasser, and that's the story of his way and how he was detained there. So I said in the headline there, be aware of detail. It's a specific question in the first example, like what did she do in the figure skating thing? And the second one is a specific surprise, like what's the person with the same name? So it's inducing questions, surprises in you to reel you in. Never mind the sound design. It can be done as in the second example, in a very slow narrative voice, or it can be done very richly in a typical Radiolab kind of thing. So try to start with a detail which raises questions in the people who listen to your program. I just emphasize this because it's very difficult to design. Once you've done your research, you have so much on your mind and you want to explain so much, it's really difficult to find the detail which raises the question. And this is always a big debate when you talk starting point of a narrative. Second, story design. There is this sentence saying story is structure, and that's one of the most undervalued things in storytelling. And I, to be honest, I couldn't agree more. To build a story is very difficult, especially in non-narrative fiction. It's a bit easier in fictional stuff, because you really can design the story the way you want. There's other difficulties in it, but it's easier in terms of, can I bend the story? And that's not possible if we talk documentaries or journalism. So it's even more difficult to do this. But the craft they use in fictional storytelling, can be used in non-fictional storytelling as well. So try to ask yourself, do you have a protagonist? And who is he or she? Is there a specific goal this protagonist want to reach? Is there a riddle kind of thing? Is there a mystery which needs to be resolved? It's all can be helpful to think in these kinds of terms without fooling people. If there is no riddle, don't make something up. People will be disappointed by the end of the story, and that will cost, again, credibility of your program. What about an inciting incident? Where does this story start? What about obstacles or conflicts? Are there other people involved? Are they of the same opinion? Do they help your protagonist, or are they probably some kind of antagonist, or do they put some obstacles in the way of your protagonist? What about plot points? Plot points are defined by little surprises or incidents the story cannot fall behind again. Like if an accident happened, it happened. I can't go back from that. So are there any kind of incidents which I can use as a plot point in the narrative to put pressure, if you will, on the story? What about cliffhanger? I've mentioned that before. So story is structure. And this is difficult because you have to think of this like all the way you are doing this, because your story changes every moment you find something new. Every moment of your research, you find a new fact or you dig deeper, and the picture in your head is going to change. And from that, you have to change the line of your story. So probably there's something like Surya Bonaly wants to become an Olympic champion. This is their narrative or focus sentence, however you would call that. And what obstacles are in your way. And probably you don't know the obstacles yet, but you'll find out. But anyway, it's her journey you can use. Said that, it's not always necessary to have the one protagonist to tell a story. That would close down a lot of different topics, which are journalistical wise very, very important, because you don't have any time, you don't have a single person as a representation of a whole complex topic. It must be possible to tell stories without one single protagonist. It is, but you still need some kind of scenes to make situations tangible and to make me feel what you want to cover journalistical wise. I have another little example of this. Probably one or two or a few of you have heard or listened to this already. It came out, the first season, I guess, in 2020. In 2021, the second season came out. It's called Stuff the British Stole. It's actually a production by ABC, so from Australia. The producer and narrator is Mark Fennell. And what he actually did in this story is he looked at the colonial history of Great Britain, of the UK, and especially at the British Museum, and really asked the question, so where did all the stuff come from? So that's hence the title, Stuff the British Stole. And this is a short example of the beginning of season 2.
Our sister was kidnapped in 1977. She was 5 years old. It was a big story in Geneva. It was the story.
On October 3rd, 1977, in Switzerland, the Ortiz family changed forever.
They lived in a chateau that was really close to the centre of Geneva.
She was grabbed from our home.
She was on her way to kindergarten. The chauffeur had driven up to the house. The driver was chloroformed and the child was snatched by 2 Italians, mafioso. So she was kidnapped.
I was 9. My brothers and I were at boarding school. We had a boarding school, a news blackout, so that we wouldn't find out from the news. And then our mother came with our grandmother and told us what happened.
What are the bits that stay with you?
We had outside the house journalists lined up with their cameras, their zooms, in the trees, behind the fence, in the garden. They were everywhere, and our father had to go and make a press conference.
You who have my daughter, don't make her suffer too much. Calm her down. Tell her she'll see her mother and her father in a few days' time.
Merci. All these different thoughts are in your head. 5 years old. What is happening to the child? What is the child thinking? How is the child managing the anguish of whether he would see her again? It was really, really harrowing.
That was when the call came.
Again, not a, how should I put it, not a taken back kind of sound design, so very rich. Also the question of reenactment. How do you deal with this in a non-fiction narrative? Is it okay? Is it not okay? Is it okay if it's transparent to everybody? Is it transparent to every listener? I don't know. So these are questions you have to ask yourself, and there is a huge variety you can answer to. But the idea behind is the same. It's like there is a kidnapping, and this is a ransom call, obviously, which is now getting in. And the father now is selling one of his antiques or one of his pictures, if I remember correctly, to pay these ransom. And then the story is about the kidnapping and if the daughter is getting out, and it's about the story of the picture. So this is like the way you already can guess how in a structural kind of way the story will unfold, like on an arc, but you don't know the details. You don't know exactly what's happening, but you know what kind of question, leading question, or what kind of hero's journey, if you want to call it that way, will be part of the main arc of this kind of story. Apart from that, it's a very, very important program which came out 2020 in the first season. Third, Again, perhaps a bit counterintuitive. I have a very silly example with it. It's an old example. I've just rechecked it yesterday, but it actually is from 2008, so it's 14 years old. It's called Cabin Pressure. That's the little key visual you see left down, Cabin Pressure, the collected series. And if you look at the actor on the right, that's Benedict Cumberbatch, who was very, or still is very famous. He was playing Sherlock at the time with the BBC. And we listened to a very short piece of dialogue. And that's why I think you can be inspired by fiction, like how they work with dialogue, why it's important that we as reporters are on the record as well when we do interviews, because the dynamic between an interviewee and us as interviewer is becoming much more transparent when we record ourselves and when we put this into the documentary or podcast in the end. So it's all about dialogue, because dialogue is revealing character, is revealing subtext. That's why it's so important. And this is a bit of a silly, perhaps a bit of a funny example of Cabin Pressure, which is actually a story or a comedy about an airline, two airlines captains, the owner of the airline, which is the woman in front, and the flight attendant. And that's the dialogue how it's going.
Do take your time, Douglas. There's still everything to play for. I'm only 26 points ahead of your 3 points. But I have every confidence you're about to come roaring back.
Yes, all right.
But I'm going to have to press you for an answer, I'm afraid.
I don't know. At 20,000 feet, I suppose about 200 knots.
Oh, what a pity. It's a lovely guess, but I'm afraid the answer on the card was 204 knots. I win again, so that's Martin on 29, Douglas still on 3. As we head into round 2.
That was one round.
Oh, don't worry. Round 2's much more fun. We say a fond farewell to the flight manual.
Thank God.
And we welcome instead our very good friend, the operations manual.
No, I'm sorry, I'm done.
Not a fair, Douglas. You promised if I joined in with Flight Deck Buckaroo, I could pick the next game.
But I hate this game.
Yes, and I hate Flight Deck Buckaroo.
How can you hate Flight Deck Buckaroo? It's a terrific game. And it's educational.
There is nothing educational about seeing who can disable the most instruments without setting off the recorded warning.
Yes, there is. You find out all the things you don't really need. Like altimeters.
No, this is educational. So, welcome to round 2 of Beat the Manuals.
Hello, chaps. Any teas or coffees?
Oh, thank God.
Oh, sorry, Douglas. You should have run.
Actually, we're fine, Arthur. We'll be landing in 20 minutes.
Oh, righto. Oh, and a message from Mum. She says, how long until we land?
Right.
So that's Cabin Pressure, was run by BBC 4, and is a bit of a silly in the sense of perhaps funny dialogue. They're obviously on the flight deck, they're playing some silly games, and they have to land now. So it's the dynamic between them. And I think in this terms, it can be educational for non-fictional storytelling, in the terms of what is dialogue revealing? Is there a dynamic between people who talk to each other? And that's why it could be important to record ourselves when we do interviews or conduct interviews and put it into the story as well, because it reveals the dynamic between us as journalists, podcast makers, audio experts, and the people we talk to. So that's the key message here, I guess. So be inspired by fiction. Deliver, and again, I think this, I cannot overemphasize, again, deliver an experience. When we say storytelling is a scenic narrative, there's something we could feel, relive, see before our inner ear and eye, then deliver an experience is key to all that. Like a scene, you really ask yourself what's happening there. It's like these 4 little meerkats coming out of the den, and the mother looking to the side, and well, take a look what's going on there. And so there's a huge story or full story in this picture. So try to deliver an experience, not only give the facts, but deliver an experience in every scene, in every episode, in every single serial. There's a rule of thumb to it. The longer you tell your story, the more of telling scenes or revealing scenes or delivering an experience scenes you need. Rule of thumb is 50-50, more or less. If you do a 45 minutes radio piece or half an hour episode of a podcast, it would be good to have at least something around 13, 14 minutes of scenes. And if you have a good audio scene, and it's, let's say, well, a good audio scene is 3 to 4 minutes, so you know it's 3 or 4 scenes within the piece. And in between these scenes, you can deliver the facts you really want to cover, which is still a lot. If you have 15 minutes of facts and a half an hour episode of a podcast, it's still a lot of facts you can put into there. The example for that is one of the most, how should I put it? It's one of the most impressive things I heard when I heard it the first time. As you can see, it's also a bit old. It's 7 years old. It's Invisibilia, which is a podcast by National Public Radio in America. It's a psychology podcast about the inner forces and beliefs which shape our behavior as humans. And this episode is called The Secret History of Thoughts. And there's 2 stories in there. And the story we are now listening to is The Locked In Man. It's from season 1. It's always told by 2 hosts, at least the first season is, Lulu Miller and Alex Spiegel. Lulu Miller now is with Radiolab as well, if I remember correctly. And we're a few minutes into the story. And what we have found out is we have listened to 2 parents, and they have a son, and their son got ill. And they couldn't find out what his exact condition is until the doctors tell them, well, look, we can't do anything for your son. It's really, really bad. We can't say what it is. It's kind of locked in symptom or syndrome. And we think he's going to die. And the only thing you can do as a parent is now taking him home and make sure he is as comfortable as possible. And then this scene is going to happen.
They were told to take him home.
Try and keep him comfortable until he died.
But 1 year passed, and 2 years passed.
Martin just kept going,
So Joan, Rodney, and their 2 kids did their best to care for Martin's body.
I'd get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, get him dressed, load him in the car, take him to the special care center where I'd leave him. 8 hours later, I'd pick him up, bath him, feed him, put him in bed, set my alarm for 2 hours so that I'd wake up to turn him so that he didn't get bed sores.
All throughout the night?
Yeah, every 2 hours I'd get up and turn him over and then get a little bit of sleep. And at 5 o'clock the next morning, I'd start the same cycle.
That was their lives.
Load him in the car, drop him off, pick him up.
3 years turned to 4.
Bath him, feed him, put him in bed.
4 years turned to 5.
5 o'clock the next morning, I'd start the same cycle.
6 years, 7 years.
Load him in the car, drop him off, pick him up.
8.
Load him in the car, drop him off, pick him up.
9, 10.
And it was so horrific.
Joan remembers vividly going up to him one time and saying,
I hope you die. You know, that's a horrible thing to say. Just wanted some sort of relief.
11 years, 12.
Load him in the car, drop him off, pick him up.
Was there any life inside?
I was not certain.
It was impossible to know.
My mind had decided he died.
Yes, I was there. Not from the very beginning. But about 2 years into my vegetative state, I began to wake up.
This is Martin.
Yes.
This is 2 minutes of audio, and I think there's so much to it. Normally, as documentary makers or as podcasters or journalists, we would cover this with a sentence saying, they took him home, and there he lasted another 3 or 4 years. So that would be it. And that would be correct in terms of facts and numbers, but it wouldn't deliver the experience the parents had. The way to work this, like first year this happened, then another year and another year and another day and another month, working with tape they got and repeating that tape, which you probably realize some bits of tapes are repeated, to deliver the experience of how stressful this was for the parents, I think is in an intimate and beautiful way to do this, because it really makes you feel how much the parents and Martin as well suffered. We'll come to Martin now in the story, and how difficult the situation was for them. And it's a completely different thing. You realize the moment the way this is done this way, in opposite to just saying, well, look, this was a situation for 3 or 4 years. And this is what I mean when I say try to deliver an experience. There's a very intimate moment in it. The mother says, well, look, at some point I hope you'll die, which obviously will be playing another part in the story. And there is this very little, very nice and it's little, but it's becoming big reveal moment at the end of the scene saying, well, look, this is Martin. Because in me as a listener, I don't know that yet in the story, but they are revealing it within the end of the scene or at the end of the scene. So there's a revealing plot point at the end, which immediately drives the story forward, because I, as a listener, ask myself, hey, what was he about? Why? What was going on there? What's his perspective? And that's where we're going now. So this is like going with the flow. So it's only 2 minutes of audio there, but it's the way they deliver an experience. I think it's intimately and beautifully done without overemphasizing the emotional part. It's emotionally in itself. You don't need to do much to this, although of course they need some music, and also the way they present the narrative is adding to this. But I think this is like a good example of how you can deal with these kinds of things, just as an inspiration or an idea. That's exactly the point. Reveal, if possible, step by step. Do you have points of revelation? I think a helpful question during research or during preparing the story is, when was I, as a documentary maker, as a journalist, when was I surprised during my research? Normally, you're a bit more informed than your listeners are, because you do your research and you're interested already in this topic. So when you are surprised by that, it's probably fair to say that listeners will be surprised by the same thing when they listen to their story, as long as you take care that they are surprised by it. If this knowledge of a surprising moment, like Martin was still alive, is becoming a part of your research knowledge, so to speak, and you start the story with this, like, this is a story about Martin, his parents is taking care of him when he got ill, but you know, he's still alive, and you reveal this at the beginning of the story, you can't use, so to speak, this as a surprise or revealing moment any longer. You shouldn't do this too far into the story. I mean, if you hold it back for 10, 12, 15, 20 minutes, people will feel fooled. And again, this is like costing you credibility. But if you do this like they did it, I think it's 5-6 minutes into the story, and then they reveal it, it becomes a very natural part of the story. And then immediately it's reeling you in again for the next chapter. So try to realize these revealing moments and try to reveal them step by step. It's always good to know who listens, when do people listen, and why do they listen. This is good to know, because then you can judge your revealing moments. Is it really a revealing moment for the people I'm doing the program for, or do they know probably already anything about it because they are experts? And then the revelation moment or the plot point would feel a bit shallow. So you have to know about your audience to make sure the plot point is really working, and even then sometimes it just didn't. That's the way it is. Try not to over-explain. No mansplaining there, if this is possible. And I have another example here. It's from the BBC. The producer was Georgia Catt, and the voice you will listen to is Grace Dent. She's very famous for presenting this program. It's called The Untold. And we listened to the beginning of Missing, which was broadcasted in 2017. It's a story about a guy who had gone missing, and it's the search of his wife. And that's actually all we've learned in the first episode. If I remember correctly, the first episode is close to 20 minutes. And we've learned about this. He got lost, or he vanished, and she's searching for them. And this is the beginning of the second episode. Here we go.
This is the story of one woman's search for a missing partner.
It was just a normal morning. He was running late for work, so he came over and gave me a big kiss. And he said goodbye to the children. And that was the last I saw him.
And you've got a...
Yeah, we've got a 5-week-old baby.
He has been diagnosed with bipolar.
Yeah.
I think that he hasn't got his medication.
He could be really, really ill, or he's a complete bastard.
If he's done himself in, who actually is going to find him?
Is this a game of cat and mouse? Is he actually getting a little bit of sick pleasure? In that postcode, there's 8 flats. I think he's there.
This is The Untold.
Until a message has got to him, I don't think I can stop.
8th of December, and Zach's been missing for 41 days. Kirsty thinks he's living and working in Nottingham, and she's narrowed it down to one particular street. She's planning to go tomorrow.
Are you actually prepared for what might actually happen?
Yeah.
But her brother is trying to talk her out of it.
What are you going to say to the guy? I mean, the thing is, they say he's there.
I know.
What are you going to do? Just, walk up I mean, you've got to have this planned. You can't just rock up there. No, I mean,
No, I
seriously,
know what
because
you
you
mean, I
might
know
go
what
to
you mean.
pieces if you don't have a plan.
So as you can see, the brother is introduced, so another character who isn't part of the first story. So it's a bit of surprise here. Oh, so there's a brother in the picture, and he obviously hasn't got a very great opinion of the husband who has vanished, and he is kind of obstacle in her search, and he's like introduced at the beginning of this episode. So it's a bit of a revelation moment here, which comes to the second last point: complex relations. The more complex a situation is, sometimes when we research this, we are overwhelmed by the complexity of the story, but the more complex it actually is, the better it is, because complex relations are interesting for listeners, as we probably know from watching fictional kind of stuff. And it also means it's yourself included. Find your narrative voice. Don't try to imitate anybody. Don't try to imitate the examples I'm probably giving here. Try to find your own voice. What do you like? What is the way you want to tell your story? So yourself is included in this, is included in this kind of network. So again, these four little meerkats probably have a relationship. Let's go scorpion hunting. I will make the first kill. So they're on the front. They never wait for me, bummers. So that's the one who's behind. And the last one says, I'll watch their back, better safe than sorry. So it's a kind of relation network they have. Second last example comes from the Trojan Horse Affair. That's from this year. New York Times and Serial have done it, Hamza Sayed and Brian Reed. And this is the beginning told by Hamza Sayed.
This is my first story as a journalist. I hadn't planned for it to be my last story, but it probably will be, given what's happened in the years I've been working on this. It's about a letter that surfaced in my city and had huge consequences for Britain. This letter launched 4 government investigations, changed our national policy, and ended careers. It's hurt some of the country's most vulnerable children. A letter that many people who've seen it agree is ridiculous.
It's unsigned, undated.
Didn't it look like a serious document, did it? Just seemed comical. Like, what the hell is this?
I remember looking at it for some time thinking, what on earth is this?
The infamous letter, was it written on parchment, in blood?
So you're presenting me with a document that turned our lives upside down?
I first learned of the letter in 2014. I wasn't a journalist then. I was a doctor who'd quit medicine, living in Birmingham, England, making my breakfast at 1 p.m, listening to the news, when I heard about the discovery of a secret communique between Muslim extremists. They were discussing a plot to infiltrate our city schools and run them on strict Islamic principles, potentially with the aim of radicalizing students. Someone had forwarded the letter anonymously to the local government, the Birmingham City Council, but it was missing the first and last page, so it was unknown exactly who wrote it or who they were sending it to. According to the intercepted pages, the plot had a code name: Operation Trojan Horse.
So key message here is the narrator of a podcast of the documentary is obviously part of the story in the way that he or she is presenting the story. So Hamza here says where he's from, what he did before that. So he's like self-reflection and positioning, subjectivity in opposite to so to speak, objectivity, which never is possible. And the last one, I've listened to a few examples now and I've remarked on sound universe. So I will skip this one, just tell you probably if you're interested in, just listen to it. Sound definitely is concept. If you're ever interested in, go to the podcast House Sound. And people, especially Jed Abumrad, there's an interview with him, like he's thinking about sound. And if you want to listen to the beginning of S-Town, it's told by Brian Reed, and it's a bit of a whimsical music in the beginning, which immediately tells you that we are going into a town, S-Town, which is short for shit town. And this is a story which is a bit like off the normal world. And this is exactly what the music will transport to you if we would listen to this example. But if you want to listen to the beginning of that podcast, and you will, I think, immediately realize what I mean. So if you think about this,
when an antique clock
or just
breaks,
skip this. If you think about this, these 7 secrets, start with question marks or exclamation marks. Design your story. Be inspired by fiction, dialogue. Do we record ourselves? Dynamic, subtext. Deliver an experience, scenic work. Reveal, if possible, step by step. When was I surprised during my research? Try to build complex relations, including yourself as a narrative storyteller, and try to host a unique sound universe. These secrets are obviously called craft. This is the way you can use them. It's not, especially in non-fictional narratives, It's never, ever the case that you can use them all the time in the best way. But ask yourself the questions, are these ingredients there? And can I make use of them? And you probably make an intriguing audio product or podcast. So I will unshare my screen and say thank you for your patience. I know it's 2 minutes longer than planned, but I hope that's fine.
I think that's totally fine. Thank you so much, Sven. We will now have some time for questions and answers. So if anyone from the participants still has a question that you'd like to submit, whether in English or Lithuanian, you can do it in the Q&A tool that is on the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom screen, usually. So you can use that to submit any of the questions that you have. I will be waiting, and in the meanwhile, I have some questions. Somehow, what caught my interest in the beginning of your presentation was the point about boring characters and how boring characters is one of the sins of persuasive storytelling. So I was wondering if you could give some examples of how you worked around this issue in your work in the past in your audio storytelling.
There's this one example I have in my head when you ask this question right now. I think it's from an Invisibilia episode, and we that's just an inspiration of how to use this. And I think it's Lulu Miller and Hannah Rosen talking about, I don't know, in their American accent about some fact, and then they say in a hardcore American accent something like, "We really need a serious scientist now." And then there's one sentence coming in from the side, and this is in Oxford British kind of, well, actually, oh, that would be me. And you immediately cannot help it to smile. And then this is exactly the scientist who is very important for the factual or actual question they have. But immediately I feel a relation to him. He's no longer a talking head, but with one or two sentences, he immediately becomes a character. Like he's funny, he's interested by that. For me as a reporter, it's these little simple things. I always try to record the moment I meet people, which is like remotely a bit more difficult, also legally, like when do I start a recording? But the moment I meet people in person, I try to, when I write the email and say, well, look, we meet 3 o'clock then and then, don't be surprised. I will have my recorder already on and with me, so they are not surprised anymore. And I want to record the moment I meet them, because that's revealing character. And in a term of interviews, I always try to ask these simple questions like, okay, can you just say what's your name and what your profession is, so I can look how loud you're speaking and I can do the leveling. And then people say, well, look, my name is blah, 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 and I'm doing this and this. So this is not very, very, very useful. But the moment you then ask something like, look, is this a good job you have? You really like that? So like a surprising question, and the reaction then often is a good one. Or another thing very practical is at the end of the interview, you have done, we sit together and we talk together. And at the end of the interview, just try to change your attitude as an interviewer, like leaning back a bit, saying, well, look, that's really something, isn't it? So, and immediately people would get more casual, and still the recording is on. And then you try to keep that attitude for a couple of questions. And then at the end you say, well, look, this is also recorded, what we talked about the last couple of minutes. Is it okay if I use it? 80% of people say, yes, it's okay. And if they say, no, that's not okay, I thought it was off the record, then it's off the record. But often it's a good result. It's actually a trick I learned from the Kitchen Sisters, which is, it's a couple of reporters from America. And they once wrote an essay in a book. The book title will come to me in a second, just to give them credit. And I think it's a very brainy idea, and there's nothing wrong with it to work that way. It's called Radio Reality. I just have to take a look at the bookshelf.
Thank you. And also, as I was listening to you, actually right now we have one question that came in, so I will prioritize that. So Vaida says, great presentation, thank you. Any tips on how to handle massive material that we gather in the process and not to lose track of good, important bits for the story?
Yeah.
So dealing with scale.
Yeah, for me, there's only a multi-layer answer, and I try to keep it short. First thing is everything you record, like the serious answer is everything you record needs to be transcripted. I mean, there's transcript software nowadays, which is like a huge advantage. And the moment I've done the interview, give it into, if it's possible for you, and if it's working, do it in a transcript software. And then, and this is the important step, go through by it yourself to correct it. And to make sure for myself, I have this kind of weird personal notation, like in some brackets, I write world-class tape, or I mark it in red, or I write, this is a bridge in episode 2. So I really try to focus on these bits so they are not lost, and I mark them immediately, because otherwise I forget I have this kind of tape. So this is one. And the second one, it has to be combined with a plot, with a storyboard. You really need your leading question. What is the question you're talking about? And is this important in regard to your question? And when it's not, it could be nice tape, but if it's not important for your story, cut it out. But if you have the subtext, like revealing character kinds of bits, they always make a good entrance tape for a new character. So this is the way I try to handle this. Transcript software, go through it by yourself, and then in relation to your storyboard, which makes sure you have, after an interview, you need some time to process this. If you do the other day, you do some other stuff, you will forget probably. And to be this disciplined takes time, takes resources, and sometimes it's just frustrating, I know.
And there's another question as well. Giedra asks, if the interviewee is a bit boring or feels like they're scared, are there any tips to make them more relaxed and open, or to sound more interesting and help you build the story?
Yeah, 2 things. Don't use meta talk. It's something like, oh, stop crying. Don't be nervous. You know what I mean? It's this meta talk. You tell people how to behave in going on to the next meta level. I wouldn't say it's never going to work, but it's never going to work. Normally people don't react very well to this because they feel more stressful. Like I say, well, don't be so nervous, it will be all right. No, I'm not nervous, because you realize they are nervous. So it's not making the situation better. So don't use meta talk. At least in German-speaking countries in the UK or English-speaking countries, it's always still taught like, do this and people will relax. And the second thing is, which is even more important, or 2 things, the more transparent you are, the safer they feel. The more you can tell them why they are important for your story, why you value their work, the more relaxed they become. That doesn't mean you should give them all the questions, because then they will know the answers by heart, which doesn't make good tape, but they need to feel orientated. This is one, so be transparent about what you do. And the other thing is, the more relaxed you are, the more relaxed they will become, which is quite interesting. We do not very often talk about the way we conduct interviews. I don't know, when the last time I listened to interview tape of colleagues, not live interviews on radio or podcast produced interviews, but to really interviews for tape. It's a long time ago I listened to this, because this is very private material. And once you do this, you realize often the interviewer is very nervous, and then they are wondering where others get nervous. So the more relaxed I am, and I can offer this as an attitude, like, look, I know what's going on, we'll struggle through this together, and the more relaxed they get. And there is truth to the following sentence: you cannot fake that you're really interested. Be really interested. Like, be there, be in the moment, really want to know what they need to tell you. Listen to them. I mean, this sounds very, I know it sounds very banal or something. It's like, there's so much truth to it. There can't be, good listening is the most important quality for a good interview. And this is you can only offer when you feel some kind prepared, relaxed. Make sure you know what you need to feel comfortable, because then you can offer this to others. It's a bit abstract, I know.
I think the greatest advice is always the most simple, so that makes sense. Okay, so thank you, Sven, very much. Thank you for being our guest. I think it was a great and interesting presentation. And I also want to make a couple of connections, because you mentioned Latif Nasser, and he was a guest in our conference last year. So I want to shout out that on the website, banguoja.lt, you can also find recordings of last year's conference sessions, including one with Latif Nasser. And as Sven hinted to interviewing techniques, one of the this year's conference sessions is about interviewing techniques. That would be tomorrow. But I want to make the announcement that unfortunately it has been cancelled, and it will happen later on. It will be recorded and sent to all of the participants and everyone who has registered for sessions later on. So that is the session with Rika Haud that was supposed to happen tomorrow at 4:30 Lithuanian time. So that will be recorded later, and then the recording will be shared with all of the attendees. Yeah, and I think these are the main announcements that I have. Again, all of the information about this year's program, the festival, can be found on the website. And I also want to announce out loud that tomorrow in the evening, there is a live conference session at the Opera Social House in Vilnius. And also there will be a screening and a listening of the products of the mentorship project that this year is part of the Banguoja Audio Festival. So don't miss out. And if you have the opportunity, please come join us. I thank all of you for participating in the session. Thank you again, Sven Preger. And I will see you very soon. The next session is at 4:30. So hopefully I will see you all there. Take care.